I can't forget him. The tall, human-like figure moved about the thick trees with no struggle at all. It was as if it was floating. It made no noise, and the only movement seen was the creature lunging forward. It was graceful, yet terrifying. My eyes grew as I watched it skim over a frozen lake and back into the trees. I tried to make out its facial features, but I couldn't. Perhaps it was the fog, or my lack of concentration. I just relived that I hadn't seen his face, though I tried. I'm sure it was just as horrifying as the tentacle-like bones extruding from his back. Time stood still and I froze the closer I got to it. Why was I approaching this thing, anyways? That I still don't know. Something about it was inviting though. Something about it made me want to come into it. My heart was pounding at a fast rate. My legs were moving faster as I chased the creature. It turned a sharp corner and I turned right behind it. I stopped myself dead in the tracks when I saw that it had stopped itself. In front of it was a small girl, around 9 years of age. She stared up at it in horror, and I feared for her, as well as mine. I tried to wave her off, but to no avail. She seemed captivated by the creature's appearance, the way I had been. She slowly stood up, and as she did, I fell back and crawled behind a bush. And all I did was watch. The creature brought its face closer to hers, and as it did, her eyes grew, and she began to shake, covering her ears. She was terrified, and compared to her, I had nothing to be afraid of. She was only inches away from the being, and she was now looking at it face to face. I'd never seen someone take in something and consider it deeply, and yet have such terror in their eyes. The little girl fell, but as I took a closer look, I could see her small chest filling with air and releasing it. She wasn't dead, but she wasn't unconscious. I took a closer look at it, and from my observations, I concluded that the being's gender was male. It took her and dragged her behind it. He was slowly creeping ahead this time, and I felt the need to follow, so of course I did, so with no hesitation. I was at the point that I couldn't even think. After several minutes of following, he stopped at the clearing. The trees that surrounded the empty area were draped with ropes and nooses. Mutilated bodies and limbs were hanging from them. One body had been hung slowly. I could tell. The fingers of what once looked remotely human had been clawing at its own throat, trying to break free from the noose. What was this? There had to be at least 30 murders committed here. I looked in terror at my surroundings, guts hanging out of torn skin, people with gouged out eyes. I began to panic, and soon I felt tears streaming down my face. And then I turned my attention to the girl. The poor girl had been gutted in the short amount of time it took for me to realize where we were at. Her eyes were gone, and her limbs had been cut off, but the creature was gripping the stubs to slow the bleeding. I only cried harder when I saw her working, yet displaced young lungs, and her beating heart. Everything was still working, because nothing had been removed fully. She was still alive. That's when, with one movement, the creature ripped her heart away from what was keeping it beating. I gagged and almost vomited, but stopped myself. I couldn't let this happen to me, not like all the other people had. I couldn't let myself be heard, but my body was frozen, so I couldn't turn around and run away. He then hung what was left of her body up from the rope. The surrounded trees had died. I'd noticed. He stopped all movement while hanging the child's left arm up. He knew of my presence, and he quickly turned around and faced me. Terror took over and I tried to let out a scream for help, but I couldn't. I knew this was death himself looked like. I saw nothing. He was faceless. He had no face, and yet he was the most terrifying thing I'd ever laid my eyes on. Right as he turned, I heard a faint shrieking noise, a very loud, ear-piercing buzzing, the kind you hear from a TV that's lost service and shows nothing but static. And in hearing this, I saw what seemed to look like static as well. Everything around me began to spin and blur into nothing but black, though before it did, the creature revealed to me that he did have a mouth, and how he did this still pains me to think about it. How he showed no pain, but instead a murderous grin. The pale skin that should have been a face slowly stretched until it ripped open in form of a mouth. Parts of skin were still intact, and the skin on the corners of his newfound mouth ripped upwards formed a contorted smile. I knew I was seeing what that girl had seen, and I knew I was hearing what she'd heard as well. I was now unconscious, and I knew for sure I wouldn't wake up. What happens next shocked me. I didn't know why he didn't kill me, and I didn't know why he'd taken me to a different part of the woods before I had a chance to wake. But for whatever reason, he spared me, and I know why. Now because I've read about it. This creature was a Slender Man, and now that I've heard more, I know that his normal prey is children, and that alone is the only reason why he didn't waste his time on me. Even though he had the perfect opportunity to kill me, he didn't because I was a child. Maybe he simply gets a sick joy from murdering innocents, but I don't want to know, and you shouldn't want to know either. I'd like this to be the last time I ever talked about it, though it is the only time. Please be cautious, and for whatever reason you may go into the woods, don't. If you decide and you spot the Slender Man, look away, as you do, and don't any longer, or the same will happen to you. And trust me, once you see him, he will reveal himself to you a lot more than once. He still to this day follows me. Please don't let the same happen to you.